So welcome everyone to this month's and the first one of the year's, the Monash Addiction Research Centre Interdisciplinary webinar series. Hope everyone had a great break over Christmas, and for those in Victoria, got through safely through the last 5 days of a lockdown. But what a fantastic way to end a lockdown with talking about psychedelics. So I'm sure you're in for a treat. Can I just start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands in which we work today and pay my respects to elders both past, present and future. So the Monash Addiction Research Centre Interdisciplinary seminars, that the idea is to bring together addiction researchers, clinicians and other experts across the sector to discuss emerging research and challenges in the addiction field. And we hope it creates a really important way of translating what's happening at Monash, both in terms of clinical and research work, and translates that into the practice and policy space. We've got a really exciting webinar for you today, but just to flag while I've got you on here, and we'll give you more details at the end. The next webinar will actually be on a Monday the 22nd of March at 3 p.m. and it's going to be on culture change, and we have a great host of speakers lined up. Michael Savick, Strategic Leader of Clinical and Social Research at Turning Point, Liz Sturgis, Senior Research Fellow at the Department of General Practice, and Tina Lamb, Research Fellow at the Monash Addiction Research Centre, and that's going to be a great discussion on culture change. For today, our focus is on psychedelics, which is obviously a growing issue that we're seeing lots of more conversations about happening in the public press and a whole range of things happening in the regulatory space. And we have three excellent speakers lined up to talk to you today about this important issue. Our first speaker is Dr. John Gardner, who's Senior Research Fellow and ARC Discovery Early Career Research Fellow at the School of Social Sciences. He's a sociologist and science and technology studies scholar with a research focus on the social dimensions of healthcare. John's research examines how social and political factors influence innovation in healthcare and medicine. His research aims to facilitate responsible research and innovation, particularly in socially contentious areas of healthcare. His work is focused on translational neuroscience, neurotechnology, such as deep brain stimulation, the emerging fields of regenerative medicine, and more recently, psychedelic-assisted therapies for mood disorders and addiction. Our next speaker is Associate Professor Adeel Razi from the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health. Adeel is Associate Professor where he's the head of the Computational Neuroscience Laboratory at the Turner Institute. His research is cross-disciplinary, combining engineering, physics, and machine learning approaches to model complex, multi-scale network dynamics of brain structure and function using brain imaging. He's also using brain imaging and psychedelics as means to understand neuromechanisms underlying altered states of consciousness. He's currently an ARC DECRA Fellow and has been awarded an NHMRC Investigator Fellowship starting this year. Congratulations, Adeel. And our final speaker and who will be discussant is Professor Suresh Sundram, who's head of Department of Psychiatry at the School of Clinical Sciences. Suresh is the head of the Department of Psychiatry at the School of Clinical Sciences and Director of Research Mental Health Program, Monash Health. He was recently unit head for adult psychiatry at Monash Medical Centre at Monash Health. He's been investigating the molecular pathology of schizophrenia and related psychotic disorders using pharmacological, neurochemical, and neuropathological approaches. These interrelated methods have been applied to parse components of the disorder, such as treatment resistance and suicide, to better understand their neurological substrates. And he's a great speaker to be able to bring a clinical element to this really important issue that we're talking about today. So on that note, you've come here to listen to these three incredible speakers. So I'm going to hand over, first of all, to John to lead this discussion. So please welcome John Gardner.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that introduction, and thank you to you and your colleagues for the opportunity to take part in this conversation on psychedelics. So hi everyone, my name is John, and as Dan said, I'm a medical sociologist. And as a medical sociologist, my interest is in the institutional and political and cultural factors that influence innovation. And this basically describes what I'm going to be talking about here today in relation to psychedelics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical legacy. I'm going to talk about the current renaissance in psychedelic research and psychedelic medicine. And then I'm going to say a little bit about what's happening here in Australia at the moment. And I'm going to end by saying a few words and inflated expectations, which has recently been identified as a potential concern in this area. So, firstly, what is actually psychedelic medicine? What do we mean by psychedelic medicine? So psychedelic assisted therapies basically involve using psychedelics such as psilocybin or MDMA within a psychotherapeutic session. So here's an example of such a session from Johns Hopkins University, where Roland Griffiths and Matthew Johnson and others have been pioneering much of the current wave of research. And currently this therapy is being explored for a range of indications: depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, alcohol addiction, nicotine addiction, methamphetamine addiction. Adeel will say more about the therapeutic mechanisms, but it appears to work by inducing a sense of ego dissolution. And this can facilitate the psychological flexibility and the social connectedness that is hugely important for psychosocial well-being. I think it's important to note here that the psychedelic drug on its own is not considered the therapy. The therapy is the drug plus this dynamic between the therapist and the patient. And this is often referred to as being part of the set and setting. So therapists are responsible for guiding the patient through the psychedelic journey and helping the patient to make sense of and integrate that psychedelic journey, that experience into their daily life. Does it actually work? Well, the results from phase 1 and 2 trials in the US and the UK are extremely promising. So good, in fact, that the US FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin-assisted therapy for the treatment of depression and MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD. And this basically enables researchers to fast-track the phase 3 studies that are needed to conclusively determine just how effective and safe these therapies are. So in short, the preliminary clinical studies are extremely promising, but more research is needed and indeed is underway. Now, as I'm sure you are all aware, this interest in the therapeutic potential of psychedelics is by no means a new thing. So LSD was discovered in the late 1940s, and by the early 1950s, people had recognized that it could have therapeutic potential. And indeed, one of the very first examples of psychedelic medicine involved LSD for the treatment of alcoholism in Saskatchewan, Canada. And as Erica Dyke has nicely described in this paper here, initial clinical results were sufficiently good to actually convince the provincial government to support the therapy. And over 700 people with alcoholism were treated in this way in that particular region. But then, of course, in the 1960s and 70s, psychedelics became entwined in the countercultural movement, and LSD in particular was promoted as a tool for challenging existing social norms and authority structures. The political backlash against the countercultural movement included an explicit condemnation of LSD as undermining values of Western civilization. And of course, psychedelics were subsequently demonized within the war on drugs, which was, of course, launched by Nixon in 1970. It's just worth emphasizing a couple of points about the war on drugs, because this has implications for psychedelic research today. So obviously, the most important legacy is the legal scheduling of psychedelics alongside drugs such as cocaine and heroin, which makes little sense given the harm profile of LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA, which Adeel will say a little bit more about later. A second consequence, of course, is the widespread public and institutional apprehension around psychedelics. So psychedelics were, in a sense, widely stigmatized within media coverage and political discourse. And these things, of course, have made it very difficult to do meaningful research. And it also meant that people who wanted to pursue psychedelics, psychedelic therapy, have had to go underground or in some cases go to different jurisdictions. However, things appear to be changing, and we're very much seeing a renaissance in psychedelic research. And at the moment, worldwide, there are over 100 registered clinical trials for psychedelic-assisted therapies using psilocybin or LSD or MDMA or Ibogaine or something similar. And there are a number of factors which have fueled this current wave of interest, and I'll mention a few of them here. So there are some very powerful advocacy groups that have emerged, particularly the Californian-based Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And one of the things that these groups have been very effective at doing is linking researchers with philanthropic funding. And indeed, there's been tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropic funding. And this has been essential because there's been an absence of funding from governments. I also think there's been a relevant cultural change. So over the last few decades, we have seen the widespread valorization of attributes like creativity, thinking outside the box, mindfulness, interconnectedness. These are all now seen as valued traits of healthy and economically productive individual citizens. And they're, of course, traits that are often attributed to psychedelics. Another really important factor has been simply the widespread recognition that we're actually in desperate need of new treatments for mental health and addiction. And it's noticeable in the US, for example, that there's a real sense of urgency on either side of the political spectrum to address issues like PTSD in ex-military and in first responders. And of course, really important here, and Adeel will say more about this, there's now also some really important and very interesting scientific explanations to support a case for psychedelic medicine. So collectively, all these factors have been fueling the current renaissance in psychedelic research. And as a consequence of this, we have recently seen a flourishing of positive and optimistic portrayals of psychedelics in the public realm, in news media, documentaries, books, social media, and so forth. And some of this coverage is quite sensational. So it's not unusual to see phrases like cure alcoholism, cure psychological wounds, wonder drug. And certainly some advocates have been almost evangelical in their public promotion of psychedelics. And as I'll show soon, hype and the possibility of inflated expectations is becoming a concern for some people working in this field. So what's happening in Australia? Well, after lagging behind for some time, things are certainly changing. We are now seeing quite a bit of activity and the emergence of what you might call a community of expertise. So we have the research support organisation, PRISM, which is a charity that has been providing scientific support and coordination to psychedelic research. There's also the very active advocacy organisation, Mind Medicine Australia, which has been doing a number of things, including advocating for regulatory change and also establishing a therapist training course. And just in the last 2 years or so, a number of clinical trials have been announced, some of which have begun recruiting. And most of these are relatively small trials, although a couple of the trials at Monash are relatively sizable for psychedelic studies. There is one trial yet to get underway for addiction, and this is the psilocybin trial for methamphetamine use disorder at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. Now, one very important development has been Mind Medicine's application to the TGA to have MDMA and psilocybin rescheduled from Schedule 9, which is basically a prohibited substance, to Schedule 9, which is, to Schedule 8, which is basically for highly controlled drugs. And this rescheduling would make it a little easier for individual psychiatrists to prescribe the drug to specific patients via a special access scheme. It is possible to do this anyway, but it is very difficult. So a rescheduling, a change from Schedule 9 to 8 wouldn't have huge practical implications, but I think for many advocates, it's been seen as a really important movement towards medicinal access. And recently, on the 3rd of February, the TGA announced its interim decision, which was to not make any changes to the schedule. And I think it's worth having a closer look at this TGA decision because it gives a useful snapshot of some of the tensions surrounding psychedelics at this very moment. So if we look at the public submissions to the TGA regarding the rescheduling of psilocybin, there were 575 submissions. Over 560 were supportive of the change, and these included submissions from Mind Medicine Australia, and also a large number of individual submissions, including from many health practitioners describing their sense of desperation for new treatment options. It also included submissions from members of the public, which were very enthusiastic about the transformative power of psychedelics, but weren't necessarily addressing the points at hand and indeed were deemed irrelevant by the TGA. 11 submissions were not in support of rescheduling, and these included submissions from the Australian Medical Association, also the College of Psychiatrists and PRISM, the Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine. And basically all of these groups essentially said that while the preliminary evidence is indeed very promising, there needs to be more research on clinical efficacy and safety, particularly in the long term, and that appropriate training protocols need to be developed so the therapy can be done safely. And this was very much the justification put forward by the TGA for not rescheduling MDMA and psilocybin at this point in time. Basically, they want to see more evidence, particularly from larger trials. So, as I said before, I think the TGA submissions reflect some of the tensions surrounding psychedelics in the present day. And these tensions are also reflected in the concerns that have been expressed by some researchers working in psychedelic medicine. So some researchers are worried that expectations might be inflated, that science is becoming conflated with other cultural agendas, and that the therapy might be prematurely rushed into clinical practice. And I've got a couple of quotes here to illustrate this, one from Stephen Bright and Martin Williams from PRISM in their recent article in The Conversation, and then the second quote from Johns Hopkins University. And I'll read this one out. They say, psychedelics are neither a cure for mental disorders nor a quick fix for an unfulfilled life and should not be portrayed as a panacea. Pro-psychedelic subcultures are increasingly fostering utopian visions for society based on research findings that, while intriguing, must still be considered preliminary. Now, just to end here, I think it's useful to step back and look at psychedelic-assisted therapies in the wider context of medical innovation in general. So this is the hype curve. This is basically a generalization of changing expectations surrounding any new technology or process or innovation as that technology or process or innovation develops or matures over time. And what we see over multiple case studies is this peak of inflated expectations early in the innovation pipeline. So people basically tend to overestimate the benefits of the new technology or process. And also advocates often hype the technology to bring different stakeholders on board, policymakers or the public, for example. Then as people subsequently become a little bit more familiar with the technology, perhaps during more clinical trials, they realize it's not going to meet their initial expectations. And then as people become even more familiar with the technology, perhaps during larger clinical trials or through implementation of the technology or process, they come to recognize its real benefits and its real limitations. And this is referred to as the slope of enlightenment. And I've seen this hype curve play out again and again in research I've done on innovation in medicine, whether it be surgical robots or neurostimulation or stem cell therapies. So I guess the question here is, where does psychedelic-assisted therapy currently sit on this curve? And I don't think this is an easy question to answer, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're very close to peak inflated expectations. So the next question then is, how might we move to this slope of enlightenment? Well, obviously, data from phase 3 trials can be really important, but something else that is very important is having local trials. So in the case of psychedelics, this means having Australian-based trials targeting substance use disorders. And the importance of local trials is that they provide an opportunity to test the therapy with Australian cohorts. They provide an opportunity to build and test some of the supporting infrastructure and expertise tailored to the Australian Health Service. And I think both these things are especially important for psychedelics, given that so much apparently depends on that psychotherapeutic dynamic between the patient and therapists. Okay, so that's all I'll say for the time being. I'll just quickly flag that there's a small group of us at Monash looking at the social context of psychedelics and thinking about, what might constitute responsible research in this space. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Adeel. There we go, Adeel. I think the platform is yours.
Yeah, thank you. What I'll do is share my screen. I guess you can see my screen now. Okay, so I'm Adeel Razi. I'm engineer come neuroscientist, and I direct computational neuroscience laboratory at Gardner Institute for Brain and Mental Health at Monash. So I will start with a more broader overview. So my interest is in broadly in understanding consciousness. And to me, psychedelics, their psychoactive component, provides an opportunity to understand the altered states of consciousness. And once I can change consciousness, I can then use imaging to measure this consciousness, and I can test mathematical and theoretical theories around consciousness. As John was mentioning, apart from understanding consciousness in basic science, there's a very strong interest and potential in psychedelics from therapeutic point of view, and lots of clinical applications, especially in psychiatry, as Suresh will later on talk about. I should mention that in this translational aspect, mind and setting is really important. For example, the dosage and environmental factors, and I will talk a bit more about later on as well. So just to start with the brief history, after a pause of nearly 40 years in research into the effects of psychedelic drugs, recent advances in our understanding of the neurobiology of psychedelics, such as LSD and psilocybin and ketamine, have led to renewed interest in the clinical potential of psychedelics in the treatment of various psychiatric disorders. Now, I'm showing here this brief history. For example, the synthesis of phencyclidine in 1926, then the discovery of psychoactive effects of LSD by Hoffman in Switzerland. Then, for example, unfortunate appearance of LSD on the streets, and later on the restrictions that ensued. Then there were several influential studies, for example, demonstration of agnostic action of LSD at 5-HT2A receptors, and which was the first neuroimaging study on mescaline, then first neuroimaging study on psilocybin and ketamine, following in 1990s, and then ketamine is now placed in Schedule 3 in the US. So with this background, I would like to mention the harm potential, if any, of psychedelics. So here we have drugs ordered by their overall harm score, with the stacked bar graphs showing the contribution to overall scale of harm to others and harm to users, with the cumulative weight of 47 and 53. So you can clearly see that LSD and magic mushrooms, that's psilocybin, they are on the very other extreme end. While if you compare this with other more accepted form of like, for example, alcohol or tobacco, cannabis. So this plot is very revealing in how harmless these psychoactive components can be. Now, quantifying the altered state of subjective effects of consciousness was problematic in the early years of hallucinogens research, but today they are validated instruments for assessing various aspects of consciousness. For example, what we call the 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness, which is standardized measure, which tests 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness. For example, the oceanic boundlessness, anxious ego dissolution, altered, visual restructuralization, auditory alterations, and vigilance states. And what I'm showing here from this study in Schmidt et al. In 2015, that, for example, the oceanic boundlessness is pretty big effect under LSD compared to placebo, which are at the bottom. And this is mainly contributed by the blissful state subdimension of oceanic boundlessness. Similarly, for example, visual restructuralization is also pretty high. And if we look at the subdimensions of it, then this is contributed by the elementary and complex imagery, and also change meaning of perception, and so on and so forth. We see that there is not much auditory alterations here, while for example, the anxious ego dissolution scores, they are also not very high, mainly because the anxiety subdimension was pretty low. And this is for LSD. Similarly for psilocybin, an important point here to make is this, that these effects, and then they are shown here, for example, the orange ones are oceanic boundlessness and so on. They are dose dependent. So the red one is a low dose, green one is high, is medium, and the black or the dark colored is the high dose. And one can see that at a high dose or medium dose, one could enjoy the blissful state or elementary visual and alterations, for example, the visual hallucinations that ensue. So these can now be very quantified very much with using validated instruments. Our research is about finding out the neural basis and neural mechanisms of these subjective effects. Moving on to, as I said, we are interested in understanding what is actually happening in the brain and how the psychedelic work. And for this, as we use MRI and other imaging modalities. And the sort of questions that we ask are, what are the neural bases of the subjective effect of psychedelics, and how do psychedelics act in the brain, and what are their some pharmacology and neurobiology. And to introduce this as an introduction, I would like to mention this really nice pictorial illustration here, which shows the 3 levels of activity of psilocybin. The psilocybin, along with other serotonergic psychedelics, act to stimulate 5-HT2A receptors in the cortex, particularly layer 5 pyramidal cells. And these 5-HT2A receptors, they are actually heterogeneously spread over the whole cortex. For example, they are really sparse in sensory motor areas, while they're pretty dense in association and visual visual cortices. Because these psychoactive drugs, they stimulate 5-HT2A receptors, this leads to a massive depolarization, massive depolarization, and then rapid repeated firing of these neurons, which is shown here. And because these neurons are responsible for organizing cross-cortical integration, this activity thus results in very profound alterations of cortical signaling and resulting in a state of extreme desynchronization or enhanced entropy, which we can measure by EEG or MEG. Also, these layer 5 neurons mediate the top-down perceptual and cognitive predictions, which form the basis of normal brain processing. Under psychedelics, the brain escapes from its usual tightly constrained and predictable ways of working, and this leads to the global increase in connectivity, and that allows new insights to pass to past behavior, memory, action, and so on. And these in turn can lead to therapeutic changes that we were discussing before, and changes in conditions such as depression and addiction, which are driven by dysfunctional brain processing. In order to look at neural correlates, we did a collaborative study with other colleagues in Switzerland, Catherine Preller and Franz Vollenweder's group. Here, this is a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled crossover study in 25 participants, where we had a placebo condition, and then we also had ketanserin pre-treatment. Ketanserin is a 5-HT2A antagonist, and it binds to that, and it should, and the idea was that it should cancel the effect of LSD. So what we showed, and what we tried to validate or provide empirical evidence for a very important and influential thalamic filter model, basically coming from animal research, which says that the thalamus works as a filter. So this is very high level illustration here, where, for example, a sensory input is coming into thalamus, and this is then processed by thalamus. Some of it is blocked, and rest goes to the cortex where it is processed. For example, posterior cingulate cortex, an important area which processes this. Under the effect of LSD, what happens is that this thalamus, which acts as a filter or gatekeeper, that filter opens, and it lets lots of information to flow to the cortex or PCC. And this leads to the information overload. So this is a sort of a mechanism that we tested in this paper, and which leads to this working hypothesis of psychedelic-induced changes in brain activity, which says that these effects, these psychedelics, they affect, for example, LSD in this case, via the corticostriato-thalamocortical loop. So what happens is that the psychoactive drugs, they increase the functional connectivity between thalamus and sensory cortical regions, and decrease the thalamic functional connectivity with association areas. As I showed on the previous slide, LSD shown to increase effective connectivity from thalamus to PCC and the ventral striatum. This results into the reduction of thalamic filtering and increase information flow to particular areas of the cortex. Then this leads to the to increase in sensory processing and counterbalancing of integrative processing in association cortex, and this disbalance may be experienced as psychedelic experience. So this is a working hypothesis, of course, and require much more empirical validation. At the last, I would like to highlight a study that our lab is currently designing, and we are in very advanced stage. We have been working under the lab for about 1 year. this is, and this work is led by my PhD student, Devin Stolica. So this study is Australia's first study that uses psilocybin in healthy controls. Here we use contextual factors like meditation and music. The experimental design is designed to reduce anxiety under psychedelics, like we are using psilocybin in this case. As I said before, the context is important. So there will be components of meditation before drug intake and also music before and after drug intake. We will be using multimodal longitudinal imaging, including functional and diffusion imaging and EEG. The sample size is about 60, and we will be opening for recruitment very soon, in a few months' time, in the second quarter of 2021. And the idea is about to further provide empirical evidence and discover new correlates of ego dissolution. With this, I would like to thank everyone. And now I should hand over to Suresh, Professor Suresh Sundram. Suresh.
Thank you, Adeel. So just before I sum up these two excellent talks, just a disclosure of potential conflict of interest, which is that I'm involved in Adeel's study and also involved in two clinical studies at Monash, which Paul Vignatsky is running. So that's just involving the use of psychedelic agents. There are two key elements that I wanted to raise and focus my attention on with regards to the presentations by John and Adeel, and maybe use them as an introduction or segue to the questions which people feel free to enter into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, which we'll get to in a few minutes. The first is about the use of psychedelics as therapeutic agents, and the second is the use of psychedelics as investigational agents. I think the first point that I'd make is that we've used the term psychedelics loosely and interchangeably, and we've confused a number of different classes of agents under the rubric of psychedelics. And I think it's important here to disambiguate some of the key groups. The groups such as the hallucinogens, which belong to the psilocybin, LSD, DMT group, ayahuasca as well. These agents which create an altered state of consciousness, which I think we might loosely term a trip. There are also a group of agents which have been classed under this group of psychedelics, which are not psychedelics, which one would term instead to be dissociative hallucinogens or dissociative anesthetics, which can also induce hallucinogenic states. And the key example here is ketamine, which many of you will know has already been approved for use as an antidepressant, a rapid-acting, relatively effective antidepressant, and we can come back to that, but very important as a therapeutic tool. And the third group of agents, which are also not necessarily hallucinogenic, but have been given the sort of unusual term entactogen or empathogen. So these are drugs of which the classic the paradigmatic compound is MDMA, which are agents which attempt to induce a state of connectedness, a state of social receptivity, a state of bondedness to others, but also to a broader state, which again is different to the sort of trip-like qualities that psilocybin or LSD classically induce. So it is important, I think, when we think about these agents to disambiguate between the three groups, although they may well share some qualities. Coming to the theme, and so I'm using the term here psychedelic in a loose, non-specific way for the purposes of this discussion, although I think what I'm doing is a bit of a disservice from what I've just said. Nevertheless, there is the role of psychedelics with regards to psychiatric disorders, and the drive that John referred to is because the agents that we have are really only partially effective, they're really symptomatic, and they're not very effective for everybody. So there is a desperate need for new treatments, and the new treatments can span a range of disorders. The one that's classically been described have been the disorders related to mood disorders, so major depression in particular, but also in reference to grief, for example. In addition to that, there are other disorders which fall under the category of anxiety disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder being a major example. And then there is evidence also to suggest efficacy in some of the anxiety disorders which are not PTSD and which are potentially worthy for further investigation. The other interesting group of disorders, which again, there seems to be some preliminary evidence around addictive disorders. And it was interesting to note that the first paper that John put up was referencing the use of LSD as a treatment for alcohol addiction. And there's been evidence subsequently to suggest that other agents may also be effective for the treatment of addictive disorders. The one group of disorders for which these agents would be contraindicated would of course be the psychotic disorders. This would include disorders where psychosis can be a feature, such as, for example, bipolar disorder, and the more classic disorders characterized by psychosis, such as schizophrenia and related disorders. This is because these agents cause altered perception and potentially through that may in fact exacerbate or even precipitate psychotic states in individuals. The risk, and this is a risk that was mentioned in the TGA rejection of the submission, was that we don't have any way of identifying people who are at imminent risk of developing schizophrenia or psychosis, and there is a risk that using these agents in those individuals might catalyze a psychotic state, which again, I think we would need to avoid. However, how we're going to do that going forward remains unclear. There are two other points that I want to make with reference to therapeutic interventions with the use of psychedelics. The first relates to the therapies that must be an adjunct or in fact a conjoint complementary treatment to the use of the agents. The drugs themselves or the agents themselves do not somehow miraculously cure psychiatric disorder and can't be perceived or referred to in that way. It would appear that for therapeutic efficacy, you need to have the agents given in conjunction with a psychotherapeutic approach. The challenge, of course, remains what is the specificity of the psychotherapy? The psychotherapy that's been proposed to date and that have been used in studies have been psychotherapies which are designed to guide the individual through the altered state of consciousness, through the trip, if you like, through the experience of the agent themselves. However, with those psychotherapies in conjunction with those agents, we seem to get a therapeutic effect, and the therapeutic effect seems to be long-lasting in the studies that have been done to date. What we don't know, though, is why should a single treatment, like when I say single treatment, a single drug like psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, combined with a single non-specific psychotherapy, which can be used for all administrations of the drug, why should such a non-specific intervention be effective in a range of very disparate disorders? So why should it be effective in, or why should they be effective in depression or PTSD or an addiction? Those questions remain unanswered, and they remain deeply problematic because they are suggesting issues with the way that the drugs may work, but also issues with the way that the drugs in conjunction with psychotherapy should be administered to such populations. An interesting recent study that came out of the Imperial College Group in London that have been doing work in this space for a while suggests that in fact the person's preconception as to what they are expecting from the treatment is an important predictor of their end response or the outcome response. In other words, if you're anticipating that you're going to have a positive experience, then the chances are you're going to have a positive experience. What that is suggesting here is a very strong placebo-driven effect, and therefore we need to determine how much of this is placebo-driven versus how much of this is active intervention. That remains an unanswered question, and I think trials currently and in future need to be able to tackle those sorts of issues. And interesting, but at this point in time, I'm not aware of anyone who's done such a study, would be to determine if in fact microdosing, that is giving a subtherapeutic dose of drug, results in the same efficacy as getting a therapeutic dose of drug, which would be important. And secondly, if we compare different classes of drugs, so for example, MDMA with psilocybin, whether we get the same therapeutic benefit in two agents in the same disorder. And again, that would be a very interesting comparison of trying to tease out the efficacy of these agents and why they are effective, and what's the best combination with psychotherapy to produce outcomes in different disorders and different patient populations. I want to very briefly, before we go to questions, talk about or discuss Adeel's presentation with really the use of these agents as investigative tools into the basis of brain activity, into the basis of psychiatric disorders, where they may be very, very powerful ways of investigating mechanisms of action within the brain and within psychiatric disorders. It's clear, as I mentioned at the outset, that there are different classes of these agents and they have different effects. They also have much more complex pharmacology, I think, than we've previously credited them with. There's been a lot of discussion about 5-HT2A agonism as a major mechanism of action. And it should be said that that was first identified because at that time we understood serotonergic systems and serotonergic receptors. We have, however, also recognized that these agents have multiple other effects, and clearly ketamine, which is an NMDA receptor antagonist on the glutamatergic system in the brain, and a drug such as MDMA, which works on serotonergic, dopaminergic, and noradrenergic mechanisms, all have different mechanisms of action. And I think it would be fair to say that at this point in time, we need to spend effort in trying to understand the underlying pharmacology before we can ascribe particular receptor systems or particular signaling systems to particular drug classes. The final point that I want to make about that, of course, is that there has been quite a bit of work in recent times in a recent Nature paper that's come out of University of California, which demonstrated that Ibogaine, which is also a psychedelic agent, can be pharmacologically manipulated to a new drug which doesn't induce the same, or appears not to induce the same psychedelic type response in an animal model, but which has the same therapeutic benefit with regards to addictive behaviors. And if that really is the case, then that clearly opens up possibilities which would be very, very exciting, both from a treatment therapeutic perspective, but also would immediately disperse any issues related to regulatory approvals and the like beyond the standard ones. The final point that I want to make with regards to that, and I think it's an interesting question to leave us with, is whether or not these altered perceptual states induced by these agents actually are the critical element from a therapeutic perspective, and whether in fact we can do without those altered states in inducing the therapeutic responses we've seen to date with these agents in psychiatric disorders. So at that point, what I might do is have a look at the questions that have been raised by people and just see whether or not there are questions here that either Adeel or John might want to answer. There's a question here which relates to the genitourinary side effects of ketamine at prescribed doses. And I must say that I can't answer that. I don't know whether either Adeel or John have any knowledge of the GU side effects of ketamine?
I mean, there are some side effects which are reported, like usually decoloration and inconsistency and higher frequencies. But I think it's pretty early to know. There is a ketamine bladder syndrome, which is sometimes talked about. So there is some scientific evidence, but probably I'm not the best person, I'm not a medic to talk a lot more about that. But yes, there is some evidence on that.
Okay. There is a question here about the use of psychedelics for non-medical reasons and about prohibition of something like psilocybin. We had a discussion about this recently, so maybe I might hand over to John. Did you want to take that question, John? Yeah.
Yes, certainly. So the gist of the question is, people do recreational psilocybin or psychedelics. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of harm or damage caused by that. So why are they prohibited at all? And great question. It's hard not to reflect on the slide that Adeel put up, and when you see the harm profile of something like MDMA or psilocybin compared to alcohol, and if you go to any emergency department on a Friday night and see how much damage alcohol causes. But look, I think what's been interesting to see is just the people really advocating for psychedelic use in medicine have been very, very careful in distinguishing themselves from people advocating for recreational use. And I, to be honest, that's probably strategically very wise. I think it's another way to see it is that it needs to be presented in very clinical, clean-cut terms to get sort of broader buy-in from politicians, an example. And I think the sort of recreational usage still carries a lot of baggage with it that unfortunately others would be uncomfortable with. So I think, I don't know if I've directly addressed the question there, but.
There's a question here about the use of these drugs in treatment resistance. And again, this is something that we've thought about a lot. My personal preference is that we should avoid it in the first instance, especially when we're doing clinical trials to select a treatment-resistant group. I think what we should be instead doing is looking at a group early in illness, or certainly where they haven't exhausted all therapeutic possibilities. And the reason for that is that we don't really understand the mechanism of action. We do want to determine if there is a signal or there isn't a signal, and that there may well be many other benefits with agents, for example, time of onset of action of agent, persistence of effects, side effect profile, all of which may make them superior to some of the current standard treatments. So I would think we should in fact not look at treatment resistance, at least in the first instance. There's a question here about dosing with regards to plant-based compounds versus synthesized compounds. And again, I think that's an important question, the dosing question, and there have been attempts to now try and produce drugs sufficiently accurately so that we can make some comments down the track about efficacy of dosing. And Adeel showed the nice paper by Vollenweider's group that looked at psilocybin at 3 different doses with different effects.
If I add, I mean, for example, there was a question about ayahuasca and mushrooms. So ayahuasca is a DMT. So DMT contains plant-based ayahuasca, and then similarly, psilocybin contains plant-based magic mushrooms. So just to add to what you were saying, so they are part of the available drugs out there.
I'm just aware of the time. There's some other excellent questions in the chat box, but I think that I'm meant to hand over to Dan at this point in time. Dan?
Thanks, Suresh. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our three wonderful speakers. I'm sure, as you agree, and as the question and answer session showed, there's lots and lots of questions that people want answered in this space. It's great to hear the work that's going on across Monash in this space, and that we have some real outstanding talent driving this research and looking at where it can lead, what its efficacy is and its effectiveness, and what some of the challenges are in terms of rolling it out in terms of a clinical response. So I take this opportunity to thank our three extraordinary speakers, John, Adeel and Suresh. Please join me in thanking them. For those who have missed this session or want to rewatch this session because there's been so much fantastic information in this session, all the sessions are recorded and are available on our YouTube channel. So please go to the Monash Addiction Research Centre YouTube channel, where all the webinars are actually recorded and available for your consumption. So please go back and revisit them. Just also like to take this opportunity to remind people about the Rethink Addiction campaign, which is a campaign that we're really happy to be part of, which is an independent coalition of over 40 organisations calling for a change, a way that we look at and how we respond to addiction. So it's looking for an improved national response to addiction treatment. Please check out the website if you haven't. Please look at considering following it on social media or signing up to the petition, which calls for a national summit and creating addiction as a national priority, and also having greater investment in addiction research, which obviously this topic is highly relevant to. I'll just finish again by just reminding people that the next Monash Addiction Research Centre interdisciplinary webinar is on Monday, the 22nd of March at 3 p.m. It's on a really important topic, culture change, and with three great speakers, Dr. Michael Savick, Dr. Liz Sturgis, and Dr. Tina Lamb. And on that note, I'd like to finish by thanking you all for your attention and welcoming you back at our next webinar on the 22nd of March. Thanks again to our three speakers, and have a great day, everyone.